Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in just a minute as everyone enters the session. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening. Okay, we'll get started in a few seconds. Okay, welcome. We're happy that you've joined us for today's presentation, How SBU Can Prepare You for a Career in Policy, Politics, and the Law. I'm one of your hosts, Amanda Mills, Assistant Director of Admissions. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Admissions YouTube page later this week. Also joining me from Admissions is Ryan Donnelly, who will be monitoring the Q&A during the presentation. Please use the Q&A to ask questions for our presenter, and we'll save time at the end of the program to answer them. You can find the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen. Now, please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Paul Kelton, Chair of the History Department, Professor of History, and the Robert David Lyon Gardner Chair in American History. Paul?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your interest in Stony Brook University. This is a great place, a wonderful place to be. I certainly have enjoyed continuing my career here, and I think you will find it a great place to be as well. Let me start off by saying that Stony Brook University is a comprehensive research university. And so what that means is that you have a tremendous range of options here at Stony Brook. And it's okay at your stage as someone interested in applying or applying to colleges to not exactly know what you want to do. The advantage of Stony Brook is that we have so much to offer and so much to explore. Another aspect of being a comprehensive research university is that your professors, those that are in front of you in the classroom, are actively involved in research. That means whether it's a chemist that has their own lab and doing their experiments, or a historian like myself. I'm actively involved in research. That means that I am going to the archives, I'm looking at old stuff that I love to look at, and trying to understand what it means, and writing up my findings for my peers to review, to be accepted. That research is very important to a university. It's the lifeblood of a university. And as a comprehensive research university, as a member of the American University Association, all of us are involved in research. So what does that mean for you? That means you can get involved in our research as well. And there are very many programs in which you can get involved in research. We have a Eureka program in which our seniors can present their own research. So coming to Stony Brook, you will be very much a part of that. So I was asked to talk to you a little bit about Stony Brook and how it can prepare you for careers in policy, politics, and the law. And we don't have, a specific major that says, oh, you're going to go into politics, or you're going to go into policy, or you're going to go to law. You can go into a variety of different majors to go into those careers. But I think what it means to you, if you are interested in policy, that means formulating policies that benefit or affect people, whether it's on the local level, state level, or national level, or global level. What that means for you is that you need a broad-based education. You need to be very flexible in the way you go about discovering knowledge. There's not just one way to discover knowledge. It's not like you go to a lab and say, well, I want to come up with a policy that improves the delivery of Social Security to beneficiaries. It's not that. You have to understand, the history of Social Security, where it came from, the finance of Social Security, how it's funded, the culture of Social Security, where it fits in people's lifespans, the psychology of it. So you need to be very flexible. And I think the good thing about Stony Brook University is that our Stony Brook curriculum is designed to do just that. We give you a broad-based education and have a flexible learning style, with not being too onerous in the requirements that you have to fulfill. Where some universities have just so many different general ed requirements that it eliminates the amount of electives that you can. We've done a very good job, I think, of clearly identifying what we really want you to come away with, whether it's a broad-based understanding of the United States, whether it's an understanding of diversity. We've done a very good job clearly defining those, but giving you the space to pursue your different interests in electives. There's not a set class in our Stony Brook curriculum that you have to take to fit the certain requirements. Let me give you an example. There's a requirement in our curriculum that's called the USA requirement. And the basic purposes of that is that you take a course, you understand the social, political, and cultural aspects of the United States. Typically, students might take that through, a U.S. history, general U.S. history course, or an introduction to American government course. But here at Stony Brook, you can take that in a variety of different ways. You can take a more specific class, say on the history of women in the United States, to fulfill that requirement. And I think that's very important for those of you who want to study, want to go into policy or politics law, is that you can find that a course that fits that requirement that gives you a chance to explore an aspect. Maybe it's a course on the American Constitution. Maybe it's a course on law. Maybe it's a course on contemporary politics that will allow you to explore that interest you have, but also fit that requirement. Our curriculum also has an experiential learning component where, particularly towards the end of your career at Stony Brook University, you are doing research. You are going in, if you're a historian, you are looking at primary evidence. You are building an argument. You are presenting a paper. And so that experiential learning is very important stepping stone to see whether you really like what it is that you want to do. Do you like formulating policy? Do you like, for example, if you were in political science, coming up with questions in a questionnaire for a poll? Those kinds of things that you get to test and experiment at Stony Brook University. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, there are any number of majors that you can take that will prepare you for a career. You don't have to go into one particular major. You can experiment, see what you like. Typically people that go to law school major in history or political science or maybe sociology or maybe philosophy. But you're not limited to that. Maybe you have an interest in human psychology and you want to do that, but you still want to go into law school. You can do that. With that said, a number of our majors in the social and behavioral sciences have interesting components to them that have a legal or policy orientation. And I don't want to name them all off now, and you certainly can explore them. But I can give you an example from my own department. We have a minor in health sciences and environment. So let's suppose that you're interested in environmental policy. We don't have an environmental policy major, but you could have a minor in history in which you get to explore different aspects of how the environment has changed, how nature and culture has intersected in certain crucial times in our history to change the global environment, and what policies have been implemented to try to address those. Maybe it's health. Maybe you have an interest in public health, but you're not sure. Maybe you don't want to go to med school. Maybe you don't want to go into a healthcare profession. Maybe you're interested in public health policy. Well, you can explore that and say something like sociology. Who does have a minor in, can't exactly remember the title of it, but a minor in the sociology of health. So you can explore that. Now, these majors that I mentioned to you all have kind of different aspects on how they produce knowledge. And that's fine. I mean, we want that. We want different ways to create knowledge and to get people to think about the complex issues that we face as in humanity. But what they all boil down to, I think, and what the purpose of education is to get you to think critically. You know, what have you been told? Is that true? Let's test it. Let's test it. Let's question. Let's raise these questions. So let's have a critical mindset. You know, let's learn. Let's learn a variety of different ways of knowing, and let's learn about different places, different peoples, different times. Let's expand our horizons in the knowledge we have. But let's cultivate our skills of communication. How do we take our critical thinking? How do we take our knowledge and communicate that? And of course, a lot of that is by writing, but also other forms of communication, you know, speaking. You have to take that complex worldview and be able to communicate that. And if you want to be a lawyer, of course, you have to develop those communication skills. So any number of majors can do that at Stony Brook University, in particular majors in social and behavioral sciences. And what I would encourage you to do at this stage is, first of all, ask yourself, is there one issue or problem that if I could work on to solve, what would it be? You know, think about that. You know, maybe you're thinking about colleges that, you know, you want a career. Well, let's think about it a little differently. Let's think about the world, and let's think about all the issues and problems. If you could choose one, what would it be that you really want to devote your time and effort to do? And when you're looking at colleges and you think of that one thing, what I would do is I would go to the college websites and try to find the courses that are offered. So in applying to Stony Brook University, look at the College of Arts and Sciences website. And when you go there, you can look at, there's a pull down tab that says departments and programs. You can look at all the departments and programs that are offered in the College of Arts and Sciences. And then you can go to the different colleges, you can go to the different departments and programs, and often they'll have an undergrad tab. And perhaps many of you have already done this. You can go to the undergrad tab and you could put on the undergrad, I can't speak, it's the end of the day, I've been lecturing today. You can click on the undergrad tab, and usually it'll list some courses or an array of courses or the complete courses, and they could show you the different types of courses. Maybe some of those courses really grab your eye, and particularly maybe they pertain to that one problem or issue that you would really like to spend your energy on trying to solve. That might give you an idea of where you want to explore when you go to college. Also, I would encourage you to go to the Career Center website at Stony Brook University. And you can, you know, I don't need to give you the website. I'm sure that it could be provided to you, but you can go to the main webpage of Stony Brook University, go to the search function and search for Career Center. And in the Career Center, it will show you what the Career Center can do for you. It can help you define your interest. It will show you that there's a number of internship opportunities at Stony Brook University, and there's pre-law advising here if you are interested in going to law school. Lastly, I'm going to speak a little bit more broadly about what college is all about. And again, I want to emphasize, it is completely okay at this stage to not know what you want to do for the rest of your life. To me, that's kind of really intimidating. I thought I knew what I wanted to do when I was applying to college. I wanted to be a doctor. Why? Someone told me I should be a doctor. I did well in science, and honestly, I knew doctors made a lot of money. And, you know, I came from a background, working class background. And I thought, well, you know, if I really want to, you know, improve my status in life, I should go to medical school. But when I got to college, I realized college was a lot more about that career. It was about broadening my horizons. Now, I was from a rural town in Oklahoma, and I went to, you know, college in Oklahoma, but still was an urban area, and it really expanded my horizons. College is about expanding your horizons. It's about learning about the world, its diversity, its diverse peoples, its diverse places, and coming away with an appreciation of that diversity. It's also about learning that there are different ways of knowing, learning that there are different ways of creating knowledge. There's not one discipline that has a monopoly on creating all knowledge. So it is about expanding your horizons and exploring your interests. And as I mentioned, learning those skills of critical thinking, using your knowledge and communicating effectively. Lastly, in terms of any career, what a college degree does, no matter what you major in, it's evidence that you've shown up, that you've engaged, and that you succeeded. So, going to someplace 4 years, going to a variety of classes, starting those classes and finishing classes and doing well is an example of who you are, your character. Did you do that work? If you show that you showed up, you've done the work, those 4 years, then that's going to speak well for whatever career. So I think I've pretty much, one last point I would make before we do the question and answers. So many of you may wonder, do I have to go to the undergraduate program in which maybe I want to go to law school? Well, Stony Brook University does not have a law school. Does that mean you shouldn't come here? Absolutely not. A number of history majors that I've had over the years have gone on to law school, and I've written many letters of recommendation for them to law schools, from NYU to Columbia to Hofstra to other law schools in the area. It doesn't matter where you go to undergrad school. Law school is a different school. What matters if you've come to a place and you've done well. So I keep saying lastly, maybe this is the last thing I'll say, I promise, that when you choose a major, it's very important that you choose something you're passionate about, particularly if you know that law school's at the end, that your undergraduate major is not the end goal. Maybe you want to go to a master's of public administration program. Maybe you want to go into MBA. Maybe you decide you want to go to business. Maybe you want to go into a master's of public health. These policy designed master's program. The undergrad degree doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is your passion for that subject, because if you find what you're passionate about, you will do better at it. And so, if you're passionate about politics and political science, then by all means choose that degree. If you're passionate about sociology and studying inequality in society and its ramifications, that's your passion. If you're passionate about history, like I was, you'll do better at that than choosing something that you're not really excited about, but someone told you that, well, this is the better degree to get into a law school. No, I don't think so. But it's going to be, your chances of getting into law school matter your undergraduate performance. So choose something that you're passionate about. You'll do better. Okay, that was the last thing I will say. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Dr. Kelton. Actually, it's funny too, because I used to do an event with the med school, and the med school said the same exact thing you did in terms of prepping students. They always say, pick a major that's going to be good to you in terms of something that you're interested in, that you're going to do well in, that you have passion about, so that especially on an interview, it's something that they're going to ask you why you chose that major and what it is that you like about it. And obviously performing the best in that too is really important. Before we take questions, you had mentioned a couple of courses, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, right? If you don't remember those, that you mentioned a few courses that were good for like preparation for law school, or like a good sort of introduction, something that give you a good background. And you mentioned courses in philosophy, you mentioned, things in history, philosophy, political science, but are there any courses that come to mind that you think would be important if somebody wanted to go into policy or law or something in that realm?
Yeah, I think many majors offer kind of legal aspects of their study. And I know in history, for example, we offer a course on law and society. It's kind of a common, course that you'll see in many universities. And that's, the importance of law and how it functions in society and changes over time. And, that might be an aspect that you would choose. I'm not as familiar with the other disciplines, but you can certainly go and look at the course bulletins, and maybe you do a keyword search like law or legal, and you probably find something. I'm actually a historian of health and disease, and I have I teach, for example, a class, Global History of Human Health, and I have a number of kind of pre-med, pre-health majors, people that are in nursing school, and but also public health, which is a policy-oriented a master's degree program. And while many of you in this webinar might be more interested in maybe it's business or economics or criminal justice or things like that, you can do searches for those different courses to find. And I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but I know I have a colleague in the history department, for example, that teaches a course on criminal justice, the history of the criminal justice system in the United States. And there's just so many different courses on this wide variety of policy aspects that you can take. And again, that's one of the advantages of being at a bigger research-oriented university, is that you can look. It doesn't mean the class is going to be taught every semester, but the chances are that whatever it is you're interested in, you can get a course on that topic. So I don't really have that many specifics off the top of my head, but I do think there's such a variety here that.
Oh yeah. And I think you mentioned it perfectly, because I do, like, majority of the students that have asked me about, well, I'm not sure exactly yet what I want, but I think I want to go into something policy or law related, something in that area. History is always their first choice because of just the nature of the subject, and also their interest in that subject, but also too that they can share different historical perspective of how policy has changed and how things kind of come around again, as well. And when we think of history, we think about teaching European history, American history, categories,
Yeah.
But you mentioned how you can go into more of a policy oriented kind of thing.
Sure. Absolutely. I'd be remiss to say, actually, my wife is a professor at Stony Brook University, Professor Stephanie Kelton, and she does teach an economics class on economic issues in the United States. I'm embarrassed I can't remember the exact title. It's I think a 300 level economics class. And I don't think you have to be an economics major to take, but that's really an aspect of policy. How federal budgeting works. It's kind of a nuts and bolts. You need to know that. I mean, I think if you're going to go into policy, like civil administration, municipal administration, you want to run for political office, you should know that.
What are some of the internships that that you're aware of in terms of, so for students here, internships, you go to the Career Center. The Career Center will help you find internships. Sometimes the departments can help too if they have things that are sort of in close proximity to them in terms of maybe it's research or those types of things. But with I guess with some of the students that you've gotten to know a little bit more, and they can be in your area or not your type of area expertise, what are some of like the experiential learning pieces that they've done in terms of, that could be research, could be internship, whatever?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're
study abroad too.
Yeah. I mean, there's such a kind of eclectic array, of experiences that students can have. We get often from political offices, Chuck Schumer's office, for example, will put up a call for interns, or or Kristen Gillibrand, or even on the I think on the local level, some of the county governments have internships that they advertise, or they send out requests to us, and we pass them along to our students. So certainly, and then of course students can volunteer. We can't, tell students to go volunteer for political campaigns or anything like that, but they do. I mean, finding out actually a lot of the students that I've written letters for law school, they volunteer for campaigns, and regardless of the party. I mean, I think it shows that they're involved and they're involved in the system. So there's those. In history, a lot of the internships that we have are with state and local historical organizations, and we are a member of our majors. Well, I don't think they actually have to be majors, but they can apply to serve as a paid intern for a local historical organization in preparation for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. That we are funding some students to go work with local organizations to develop their own displays. And it's kind of interesting. This does have a policy angle to it, in that, public history, that is how the public consumes history or sees history, whether it's in a museum or a monument. A lot of that's policy oriented as well. Who chooses who to celebrate, to who gets the statues and who doesn't. And we're sending interns to work with local groups to critically analyze how that's been done, and who gets forgotten. And so those are policy oriented internships, I would say. Let's see, and then the experiential learning. Any students who are part of the honors program here do honors projects, and that's a year-long project in which they produce a project depending on their field. In history, it's often a written paper of about 25 pages or so on a particular kind of a more narrowly focused research project. I had one last year he did on the Battle of Kingston, which is Kingston, New York. Maybe some of you are from that area. The British came in and I believe they burnt down Kingston. Kingston's since been rebuilt. And he did it on that, but he moved it in a very interesting direction. How the people of Kingston have commemorated that over time, and how it became kind of a local feature of tourism to Kingston. And that stemmed from an honors project. We don't do it so much in history. I'd like to do it, where we employ undergrads in our research to gather data or to gather evidence for us. But I know a number of other programs do. So one of the things if you're very interested in that, particularly building a resume for to go into law school or go into a public administration master's program, is to be very proactive, and to approach your professors and ask them, are there research opportunities for me at this stage? The worst that could happen is no, and that's fine. But you keep at it, and you might find that by asking the professor at the right times that, yeah, well, actually, I have this grant and I do need student workers. And it may mean something in some ways kind of menial in a way, starting out, that you're actually going through old newspapers and gathering up statistics. But that shows a lot. I think that shows a lot. And there are all kinds of opportunities, but often you as a student have to be proactive about that as well, and go out and just ask questions and not be afraid of asking those questions.
Yeah, for students who don't know, we do have a Eureka program too, which stands for Undergraduate Research and Creative Activities. And that is an office that's staffed here that will help students find research to do on campus, whether it's their own, that's something that you want to do, or it's something that you'd like to get involved in departmental research that's already going on between faculty, grad students. I'm sure some of the grad students too would love to have some undergrads helping them. And
Sure.
one of the key things, if you want for grad school, is definitely research, which is why Stony Brook has an EXP course that's EXP Plus, I should say. That's basically you could do research, or you could do study abroad, or you could do an internship. and that would satisfy, that requirement.
And I would say the history capstone course that fulfills the EXP Plus is our senior research seminar, and I've taught that many times. And students have done such a wide variety of subjects, and at least in my class, I'd really encourage them to explore whatever they're interested in. And I've had students do things like one of my students that I just wrote a letter of recommendation for law school did something on the American with Disabilities Act, for example, in her senior research project. And she knew to begin with that she was very interested in this aspect of the law, and she wanted to go into it. And so it's an opportunity to explore that interest.
And the capstone course, they have a choice of what they want to do?
There are some professors strict kind of limits on it depending on their comfort level.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like you never know what you're going to get. You say, go do what you want to do. And I don't feel comfortable, for example, if someone wanted to do something on ancient China, I would not know what to tell them. And chances are, the resources available at Stony Brook, or anywhere in the United States are not going to be that great to do that. And you'd have to have a certain skill level. But in general, yeah, there's some leeway. Maybe it might be around a particular theme. Maybe it's colonialism, which is a broad theme. How imperial powers exerted pressure and influence on lands and peoples that were not theirs. But colonialism extends to the present day. So it's something that you could look at. Colonialism impact on law, for example. So yeah, there is. I'm probably more, for better or worse, let the students kind of do what they want. I've had some students that have gone into areas where maybe they shouldn't have. Maybe I should rein them in a little bit. But then I've had students that really challenged my view of what history is. And I had a student write a paper on. They went back and looked at their high school yearbook or high school newspapers, and wrote over time. So look, from the high school was just founded in the 1950s. It's kind of a suburban white flight high school, but looked at the high school and to look at youth culture and how it's changed over time. And it was a fascinating paper. And I would have never thought of looking at that. And he had access to these from a database. So again, I would encourage anyone to just try to think about how you can take your interest, explore them in kind of unique ways, and to build kind of a very unique project.
We had a question that came in here for someone potentially interested in the FBI. Are there areas of study that you would recommend? We learned about, a multidisciplinary major as well as political science, psychology, and sociology. Do you have suggestions? Would you recommend certain history classes as well?
I'm interested in being employed by the FBI.
So I guess to answer this student's question, the FBI, it's an exam, but they do look for particular backgrounds. Sometimes it's computer science, sometimes it's accounting, but there are plenty of students that have gone to law school that they've recruited too. I guess the students looking more in terms of maybe I would probably say more in the law end. It seems going that route. I would assume, unless the student wants to put in an extra comment just to specifics. But I guess if students are interested in some kind of federal law enforcement, something that's much more data. We were just talking about research, so I mean.
Well, yeah. I mean, in fact, I assume that. I just want to make sure. And I've actually, over the course of my career, I've been teaching college since 1998, and I've gotten a number of calls from the FBI. Calls because they're doing background checks on people that I knew that have gotten history degrees, undergrad, masters, or PhDs. And that's not unusual for FBI employees to have degrees in history or political science or sociology, You don't have to major in criminal justice. I don't believe we have a criminal justice major at Stony Brook University. Criminal justice, what is it? It's an interdisciplinary program anyway, in which you blend a lot of these things. So the fact that we don't have one doesn't mean that you couldn't then go into law enforcement. That again, it's the skill set. I mean, what do you, if you're going to be an FBI agent or you're an investigator, right? I mean, that's your Federal Bureau of Investigator. Well, what are you investigating? Well, I guess if you're investigating computer hacking or computer cyber terrorism, then yeah, you would need a background in computer science. But a lot of investigation is documentary. You're looking at documents, you're looking at paper evidence, you're looking at paper trails through time. And history definitely trains one to do that very well, I would say. So it's not, sociology, you're developing different methodologies and techniques to understand society. So yeah, it's all of these different disciplines would prepare you, I think, for a career in law enforcement. So I would add, if that's your interest, I would choose a major that you're most passionate about and what you're going to do well in, and then that way you'll I think be a better job candidate for the FBI or law enforcement.
Yeah, and it's always think about critical thinking too. Something in that. Would you say there's a course that in history that you know of that? I mean, everything you could basically have a case for critical thinking in every aspect. But would you say that there's I think especially your field in terms of the health policy, has to definitely be, especially what we've been through with the pandemic, a lot of critical thinking in terms of how public will react to certain policies and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, I think there's when you're dealing with the public and public affairs, why does the public react the way certain things the way they do? What assumptions and mythologies that you have? We actually don't teach it here. Probably shouldn't say it, but I taught it at another school before coming here, and I had a colleague that taught conspiracy theories in U.S. history. And but it is one of the things that's common throughout U.S. history. So if you were to take a class, say, on Jacksonian America, which we do teach, you would learn about the development of conspiracy theories and how people act on those theories rather than reality. And some of those conspiracy theories, like the AntiMason movement, you may have never heard of it. There was this movement in American history in the 1830s in which there was this belief that the Masons were conspiring to destroy democracy in America. And there's a political party that sprung up called the AntiMasons. Well, there may be an anti-Mason movement now, I don't know. But by studying that, you're aware, of the kind of psychology of why certain people, what drives people to join these conspiracy movements, what's going on politically, economically, socially, what changes are going on. And those changes may not be the changes that are happening now, but it encourages you to ask the question, what's going on? How do I understand what's changing in America today that would lead people to embrace these conspiracy theories? And yes, it's politics, it's economics, it's gender relations. Imagine changes of masculinity and how that people's perceived masculinity is being challenged. Those are the questions that you'd want to ask as someone that maybe studies, that maybe investigates, riots and protests and what's going on. And those questions are asked by historians, they're asked by sociologists, and you train yourself to ask those questions and create ways to find answers.
Absolutely. Anybody any other questions before we leave? I wanted to thank Dr. Kelton for his time, especially at this busy time since finals are almost upon us, or right upon us. Any questions, any last minute questions here? I don't see any others. Thank you so much for doing this for us and I'd like to thank the students too as well for joining us. Paula, thank you as well from the College of Arts and Sciences, and obviously Amanda. But if any of you have any questions about admissions, about university in general, please give us a ring, or you can email us. All our contact information is in the chat here, but obviously you'll get information since you signed up for this program. But again, thank you, Dr. Kelton. I really appreciate your time tonight, and I hope everybody is well and has a nice happy holiday. Take care.